Hello, yes again, David here for the second time today. Right, this Sega Saturn, yes. If I can just get my particular Saturn out. Yes, the Sega Saturn. Many people say it was the kind of final nail in Sega's coffin as a hardware developer. History of the Saturn was, it was about 1993-94, and Sega's R&D team wanted to basically push into the 32-bit era. I mean, they kind of, to an extent, tried to extend the Mega Drive / Genesis lifespan with things like the Mega CD and the 32X. They never took off, namely because the Mega CD was plagued with Mega Drive Genesis ports just with fancy rendered intros, and the 32X had no real advantages over the Mega Drive in terms of actual software. And quite literally, Sega of Japan basically had a research project called Aurora, what would eventually become the Sega Saturn. Sega Saturn launched, I do believe, in 1994 in Japan. I do believe it was 1994. I actually favorited the wiki page, so I really should be up on this. Yeah, it was 1994. And it managed to sell 170,000 units in the first weekend of release or so. And everything seemed to be going swimmingly in the beginning. And I'll get to what happened to the Saturn in the end. Launched about 1995-96 in North America and Europe. Right, the hardware of the Saturn. Now, this is a big contention with the Saturn, and it's one of the main reasons it flopped as a console. You see, and I don't sort of inflame any fanboys, the Saturn was kind of similar to the way the PlayStation 3 is today. It had a very convoluted, overly complex architecture that was very hard to program for. It was powered by two Hitachi CPUs. I do believe I've got the model number here. Yes, the Super H2 7604, two 32-bit processors, each running about 28 MHz. They had to share one data bus though, and that was the big problem. The dual processors, they couldn't use it at the same time. So it had to either alternate between one CPU to the other, or as many programmers would do, they just used one CPU, thus rendering kind of any kind of computational advantage effectively moot. It had two graphics processors, and another big problem with the Saturn was it used quadrilateral rendering when it came to polygons. This was about the time the industry was moving towards triangular polygon rendering, as in today. I mean, a 3D model is effectively made up of loads of little triangle-shaped polygons. Saturn was loved with doing quadrilaterals, which basically added a whole layer of complexity, having to redraw multi-plat games on Saturn hardware. Exhumed, which was a first-person shooter, had to be completely rebuilt from the ground up for the Sega Saturn. But on the flip side, what the Saturn did very well was 2D games. Things like Capcom did a lot of 2D games for it, because the Saturn had 2.5 megabytes of RAM compared to the PlayStation's 2. And quite literally, the games loaded quicker with most 2D fighting games on the Saturn. They didn't suffer so many animation cuts as the PlayStation versions of the various games. And one of the big advantages was the 1 and 4 megabyte expansion cartridges that plugged roughly into this slot here at the back. And a lot of games would only run with these expansion cartridges, things like Astra Superstars, X-Men vs Street Fighter, which I don't believe had a PlayStation version. Ooh, what else? The Dungeons and Dragons arcade game from Capcom only ever saw home release on the Saturn in Japan, and they can fetch a very big price. I saw it on $150 on eBay just yesterday. And another big problem that got the Saturn throughout its lifespan was the way Sega marketed it and ran the business side of it. They constantly fell out with third-party developers. Third-party devs would constantly say the Saturn was too complicated to program for compared to the PlayStation. Sega effectively ignored them. There was very little debug or kind of computational manuals packaged with the development kits. So basically, developers had to basically write their own language for the Saturn in order to develop games for it. More incompetence came with the personnel who were behind the Saturn. Bernie Stoller, who was the head of Sega of America, once was famously quoted, I'm quoting him verbatim, "RPGs do not sell in North America." This was in the weekend that Final Fantasy VII was launched for the PlayStation. And I do believe, history holds up what happened there. The Saturn in the end sold about 9 million units worldwide. 6 million in Japan, about 2 million apiece in North America and Europe. That's nothing compared to like the 37 million worldwide that the N64 sold, and I think the 180, maybe 190 million that the PlayStation sold. It was just such a headache for Sega to get developers on board for it and to get games made for the system. Developers abandoned it in favour of the PlayStation. PlayStation, although weaker in some aspects, was a lot easier to program for. Sony were a lot more easier to work with. They were more forthcoming with the development tools and support. Saturn held on for a limited time in Japan, but it was dead within 2 years in America and Europe. And I can remember the Saturn shelves in like big game shops would progressively get smaller and smaller, like a single shelf compared to the entire shop being just completely PlayStation, more or less. I like the Saturn. I think it was a quite underrated system. I mean, yeah, it didn't do particularly well in its lifespan, but it had a library of excellent games. I mean, Guardian Heroes, Radiant Silvergun, and probably some of the others I mentioned. And if I reach down here, I've still got an original Sega Saturn pad, which I use with quite a few of my emulators. And that will lead me conveniently on to emulating the Saturn. It hasn't been easy. I mean, emulators are almost there with the Saturn because of its difficulty in programming. Emulating it was a great job as well, because you're emulating the 6 effectively hardware components that were sandwiched together by Sega. Components that were never designed to computationally work together, such as the 2 Hitachi processors, the VDP graphics units, and there was a separate sound chip as well. It's like 6 individual small CPUs that they tried to squish together and make work, but they never did. You can pick up Saturns quite cheaply on eBay if you're prepared to look around. I think you can pick up like the original black and grey European and American Saturns quite inexpensively. However, there were quite a few special editions of the Saturn that were only released in Japan. Now, I picked this Saturn up about 8 years ago. I mean, this was like the standard white model, although mine's yellowed quite badly. That was launched in Japan. I mean, it's a very solidly made console. There's the CD tray. A reset button. Very chunky build quality, really solidly put together. And if I bring it over here, this was the 4 meg expansion cartridge that I mentioned earlier, which just plugs into the back here. 4 extra megs of work RAM, which was a big total back in the day. That's pretty much all I can say on the Saturn. Underrated system, probably was treated quite unfairly throughout its lifespan, but history's written by the winners, and PlayStation won. So PlayStation is probably what I'll be doing next. So this is David signing out.